of the fantastic features that shape objects offer us in After Effects is the ability to create repetitions. Now, repetitions are a fundamental graphic design concept that we use all the time when we're working on still designs. However, when it comes to motion graphics, they can truly make an entire design come alive. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. So for this video, what I want to do, in the past, I showed you how to create shape objects and how to bring the center of the shape layer onto the object that you had created. That was by pressing the Control key, keeping it pressed, and double clicking on the anchor point, and that would bring in the center of the layer to the actual shape that you created. There's another way to create shape objects, and that is to actually tell the program, I want a shape object. So instead of having to draw it with the drop-down menu here, what I want to do this time is I want to go to the Layer drop-down, New, Shape Layer. Or you can always right-click on your timeline, go New, Shape Layer. All of the objects that you see under this New drop-down are the same ones that you see under Layer, New. So you have a faster way to access that from the actual timeline. So I'll go ahead and click Shape Layer from the flyout menu, and you'll notice that it creates a new layer that contains nothing because the contents were not drawn, which is what we were doing when we were doing it with the drop-down menu here. And but it's there. I can see the anchor point, and it has transformation values. So there's nothing there, but the layer has been, it's like a placeholder. So now what do we do with a shape layer when we create it this way? Well, you can go ahead and start adding content to that layer. That's why you have that content area, and you have this Add drop-down menu. Now you can add several things to a shape layer. The items that you see, the things that you see, are the objects that you see up here. These are the shapes that we work with. We have rectangles, ellipses, polystars, and paths. We also have the ability to add different values for fill, stroke, gradient, and gradient stroke to those objects that we create. You can keep on adding items onto a shape layer, as you saw in previous videos where we had more than one shape layer, more than one shape object into a layer. And then you have these properties that allow you to modify the layer in many ways. So they're extremely useful. Today we're going to be talking about repeater. So let's go ahead and add to this shape layer. I am going to add an ellipse. And you'll notice that it adds an ellipse, but it's an empty ellipse. It doesn't have any transformation value. It doesn't have any properties to it other than the size and the position. That's all it contains when I create it. So if I want to add a color to that shape layer, I need to go into the drop menu and go Fill. And then with that fill color, now I have options that I can control for that specific shape layer. For that specific shape, sorry, not for the shape layer, just for the shape. These two things are married to one another. Now you'll notice that as I am adding, they keep on stacking up this way. So for example, if I wanted to add at this point, let's say I go to the shape layer and I want to add, let's say a polystar, it will be added into the stack right below the other shape, and the fill that I had created affects both of those two things. So if I change the color from red to white, you'll notice that both of them change to white. Now, what if I don't want that? What if I want to have all of my shapes independent from one another? Well, let me undo all the way till I undo the polystar. So let me go ahead and remove it. And now I'm back to having the ellipse and the fill. In order to create separate shapes that you can control independently, you can either do it by the way we did it, meaning drawing each one of them through the shape layers, through the shape object tool up here through the drop-down menu. Or if you're doing it the way I'm doing it right now, you can go ahead and create what we call groups of shapes. So if I select more than two items within the contents of a shape layer, I can right-click and choose Group Shapes, which is Control G, the same shortcut that you use to group objects in Illustrator and in Illustrator or in Animator, no, any of those other programs, or InDesign if you're a graphic designer, is the same grouping shortcut. So if you select those and press Control G, then or Command G on the Mac, you have what is called a group, and you can actually select that group label and rename it if you want to. So I'm going to call this one by pressing the Return key. When I have it selected, I am going to press and I'm going to call it Circle, so that I know what is contained within that particular group. So that is my circle. Now with that done, what I want to do now is select contents or go to the shape layer level. And now I want to add my polystar. Now you'll notice that the polystar has been added underneath the grouping for that circle. So my polystar is, again, just like when we were drawing, when we were creating the circle, it's an empty shape. It doesn't contain anything. So I need to add to it a fill. And if I want to add to it whatever else I want to add to it, I can go ahead and control that as I keep on adding. And if I want that to be a separate object, I can select all of those items that I want to be the separate group, Command G or Control G on the keyboard, and then I usually like renaming my groupings so that they make sense to me. So that now I have two separate objects. One is the circle and the other one is the star. Now let's go ahead and add another item to that circle. So with the circle selected this time, and this is very important, when I want to add something to a specific grouping, I need to select the group. When I want to select it to the entirety of the layer, I select the layer label. You'll notice that when I select the layer label, the object over here gets deselected. If I want to add on to that circle, I need to select the circle itself. And I can now go ahead and add, I have a fill, but I also want to have a stroke added to this. So if I go in there and I say add a stroke, it adds the stroke under my ellipse and not under the stack of things that I had for the circle and the star. It actually belongs in there. Now, however, let's assume for a second, okay, I want to have that, and by accident, I didn't have this selected. So let me undo this really quick. So I'm gonna remove that stroke and say, for example, you forgot to select the circle group or the object if you had an object selected that you had already pre-created from the drop-down menu. So let's go ahead and select the shape. And I forgot that I have that selected. I go ahead and click Add, and I say Select and Add a Stroke. Now you'll notice that the stroke gets added at the bottom of the stack. And when I go into that stroke and I increase its size, for example, let's take a look and say, I want this to be about that thick. You'll notice that it affects basically everything that it's inside that particular layer. If I go ahead and place that circle underneath the circle, it only affects the circle. But if I go ahead and grab that and place it inside the circle, it now only belongs to the circle. There's no way it will be affecting my star in any way, shape, or form. So if it's between them, if it's between that, it will affect whatever is above it. If it's inside it, it will definitely only affect whatever it is attached to. So that's what you want to do. In this case, I want to go ahead and make that, actually, I want to increase that stroke to about 50. Actually, maybe even bigger. I want to make it substantially bigger. So like this, something like that, 90. Let's say I make it 90. And then I want to collapse the stroke, and I want to go into the ellipse path itself, and I want to increase its size from 100 to, say, 500. Now you'll notice that I've increased the size of my circle, but my stroke has not changed in size because it's independently controlled by the stroke property that I had added through the add mode, through the add drop down. So that is an advantage of having these separate by adding them separately through the add drop down, because it gives you complete control over each one of the different features of the shapes that you're working with. So now with this done, let me go ahead and bring the star from the bottom of the stack. Let me close that circle, bring the star up to the top. And I'm going to place it there, and I'm going to change its fill color from red to white. Actually, I'm going to make it blue, let's say, let me do a couple of changes. I'm going to make my star red. I'm going to keep it I'm going to make it white. I'm going to make my star white. I'm going to make my fill color for this, I'm going to keep it red, and I'm going to make my stroke for the circle, let's say instead of white, I'm going to make it dark blue, something like this. There you go. So it almost looks like Captain America's shield. So now with that done, let me collapse this really quick. What I want to do at this point is I have independent control of everything in here. So absolutely everything, it's independent, including the layer itself. The layer contains its own values, its own set of transformations. So what I can do at this point is I can go ahead and select the star, for example, and I can move it. Now, you'll notice that as I move the star moves, and I can change its position. Let's go ahead and go to the polystar position, and I'm going to move it up on the y-axis. So I'm going to move it up, and then I am going to scale it down, let's say to, I can scale it from here. Let's go ahead and scale it down. You'll notice that that is scaling based on the reference point of the anchor point of the layer. So the anchor point of the layer is in the center of the screen. And the reason for that is because when I created it, I went layer, new, shape layer. When I do that, the computer doesn't know where to create the layer. So it's going to set up your layer with the anchor point in the center of the visible area, in the center of your composition. So let me go ahead and actually scale this down if I want to do it that way. Or I can go ahead and let me go back all the way to the beginning. Since the Polystar is a separate path, I can select it, move it up, and then scale it down independently. So as you can see, both of them are independent, and in this case, because I had the Polystar selected, the actual path selected, that's what I moved up. You will notice that the position didn't change as it was changing a second ago. So because I changed it that way, that's why my scaling is based on the position of the actual path, as you saw a second ago. So if I go ahead and, let's say, for example, get close to this, I'll do that really quick. Let me bring it up and bring this down. If I want to move it, I am moving the actual Polystar. I'm not moving anything with relationship to the main layer. So with that done, let me go ahead and actually even decrease it a little bit more. There you go. So now what I want to do is I want to take advantage of that repeater tool that we saw a second ago. Remember, like I said before, if I have this shape layer selected and I go ahead and click and add anything, it will be added to the stack. So if I select repeater, it will select a repeater that will repeat everything that's above it. So if I want to repeat only the stars, I should place that repeater right below the star. And you'll notice that by default, it repeats 3 stars. So if I open up the properties for that repeater, I can see that by default, it gives me 3 copies. And if I open up the transformation values for the repeater, it tells me that the position is offset on the x-axis by 100 pixels. That is the default. Anytime you apply a repeater, those are the settings that it gives you. So for example, let's say I want to have 15 stars around my shield. Well, I can go ahead and enter a value of 15 for how many copies I want. And then I can go ahead and say, okay, I want that. But what I really want is I don't want any separation on the position. So I don't want any spacing between these things. So if I go ahead and set that value to 0, I have 15 copies of each one inside the actual, right on top of one another. What I do have, however, because you saw that these things change in position based on the position values, then that's telling me that that point of reference from which it is looking at things is based on the actual layer, which means that if I rotate those copies, they're going to start rotating around that anchor point. So how many rotations do I want? Well, if I start increasing, you'll notice that it increases to cover the entirety of the space that I'm increasing. So all I need to do is figure out how many stars fit, how many degrees do I want each one of these to be, the space between each star, being that they are 15 and the rotation for a circle is 360. So all I have to do is under the rotation value, I need to enter 360 degrees divided, and the division is the /. So 360 divided by 15. And that would give me the exact amount of degrees that will make sure that each star is equidistant from one another. Now that is the one of the tools for using the repeater. Each star that you see here is a copy of the original star. So if I go back and change that star shape, for example, if I go in and I'm going to zoom into it to get better access to it, pressing the space bar, I get the hand tool, and then I'll move it. Then I'm going to place it a little bit lower and decrease its size slightly. You'll notice that each one of them responds accordingly. So I now have that set up. I'm going to go back and say fit to up to 100% so that I see the entirety of what I'm working on. And so that created that very, certainly fairly complex design for a motion graphics environment in a very quick amount of time. Now, where this gets really cool is that I can go ahead and keep on adding stuff to this. So if I want to have another repeater of those stars, I can just simply go ahead and say, okay, I want to add a repeater to this. So I'll go ahead and select repeater, move that repeater right below the other repeater, and now I have copies of my 15 stars. Once again, it gives me a default of 3 copies, and it gives it in the transformation values for that repeater too. It's offset by 100 pixels on the x-axis. So let's enter that really quick again to 0. And let's make the number of copies, let's make them about 15 again, let's say. And in this case, instead of rotating, I am going to scale. And you'll notice that this automatically gives you it really, I mean, it's a fairly complex set. This looks like it's a ton of layers, and you'll notice that we're only working on one layer. That's all we have been working on. Not only does it work, this gives you this complexity, but let's say, for example, I want to create some sort of psychedelic rotation. Well, let me go ahead and apply rotation values to that second repeater. I want to set a keyframe with a value of 0 at the beginning, 1 with a value of, I'm just going to roll it so you guys actually see what this does. And so I'm going to just simply rotate it 45 degrees. And then I'm going to go back to 0 degrees at the 2-second mark. That's that 2 seconds? Yes, 2 seconds right here. So I'm going to make that 0 again. And you'll notice that when I play this back, I get really fluid motion, fairly easy. And I can go ahead and ease out of these things. So if I right click and I go to my, keyframe assistant, I can go ahead and ease on this, which gives me a more organic rotation. I mean, it looks really cool. So it gives you a lot of bang for very little work. The thing to be understood here is that the stacking order of things. So these repeaters, this star is repeated by this repeater, and that repeater is repeated by this repeater. The background circle is just a circle. Now, if you want the circle to be included within these repetitions, then you would put the repeaters underneath it, and that's how that would work. Another use for something like this is when we are creating bursts. You probably have seen some of those videos that I have shown as samples in class. So when you want to create circle bursts, for example, let's say you're indicating that there's light or energy coming out of something, you can go ahead and create these by using repeaters. So let me go ahead and create a new composition. I'm going to call it bursts or burst. If I can type, that is. There you go. And I'm keeping the same settings as I had before. So with that done, what I want to do is I want to create a new a new shape object, shape layer. And into that shape layer, I want to add a box. Let's say I'm going to create a rectangle. And for that rectangle, I also want to add a stroke to that. And I want to make it, not stroke, sorry. I want to add a fill. So let me go ahead and add a fill to this. Fill. And I want to make that fill white in this case. And I want to now change the actual size of that box. So I want to make that size about, right now it's 100 by 100. I want to make it probably like 20 by 100. Notice that this is length is constrained, so I want to make sure that I unconstrain it before I make that change. And so that's about 20 by 100. That's the size that I want to work with on this. So that's the first setting, the first light burst that I want to be working with. Now, if you wanted to actually do this and make it fancier, or make it look a little bit more user-friendly, you can go ahead and use other shapes if you want to, but in this case, we're just doing a simple burst. So I want to select these two guys, the two contents that I added to that shape layer. I want to right-click them, and I want to group them. Now, with that grouped, I want to add the repeater. So I want to go ahead and say shape layer, repeater. And the repeater will give me, like I said before, it will give me default 3 copies of this. And so I want to make this, say, for example, 15 copies. As we did before, then I want to go into the repeater's transformation values, and I want to make sure that the position is changed to 0 on the x-axis so that they're all stacked up on top of one another. Now remember, by default, any item that I create, in this case the rectangle, is referenced to the center point of the shape layer. But if I want to move that and offset it, I can just simply select the rectangle path and change either its position value or simply move it with it selected so that it doesn't reference that shape position anymore, the shape layer's position anymore. So that's how we're going to animate this. So in order to animate this, what I want to do is, since I make 15 copies, I want to create a rotation value of 360 divided by 15 so that I have 15 copies. And it looks like a circle until I actually start offsetting this thing. So when I offset this thing, under the rectangle position, if I go to and I start moving the y-axis, you will notice that the thing basically offsets and I see my 15 copies. So that's exactly what we want to do. I want to start setting up some keyframes. So over here, I want to set a position keyframe, and I want to also set up a size keyframe. Then I'm going to go down to about 1 second, and I want to move that position value by going negative on the y-axis. That means I am moving that rectangle that I created originally up on the screen. So I want to move it up. And at the same time, I want to resize this, the width of that box to 0. So basically this scales down through time, giving you that burst effect. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to do. The next thing I want to do is I want to change the opacity overall of the entire thing. Since under the rectangle settings, I don't have opacity, I need to start looking to see where I can find opacity. I have two options. I can either go to the fill and change the opacity over here, which is one option, and that would be controlled through the fill, or I can use the actual group transformation dropdown, which contains also an opacity setting. So for example, if I change the opacity here, I want that to be 100% when it first comes in, and then I want it to be about, actually, you know what? I want to make it 100%, but I want to make it 100% at about 3 frames. So around here's where this is going to be 100%. So I'm going to make it 0 at the beginning. I'm going to copy that keyframe. So I'm going to copy that key. Whoops, I moved it. Copy it. Then I'm going to paste it at the 1 second mark. Now, you want to start referencing all these things. And you notice that when I collapse the different windows, the different objects, I get basically these little circles that give me guidance as to that there are some keyframes in there, but they really don't show me anything. They are really not showing me an actual, it tells me there's a keyframe there, but I don't know how many keyframes, and I don't know how many properties have been affected. If you want to see all of the keyframes available in a particular layer, any layer, keyframes that have been applied to that layer, press the U key on the keyboard. So if I press U, only the things that have keyframes become available to me. So if I press the U key on the keyboard, that happens. And now I can go ahead and bring this down and paste that second keyframe so that it goes to 0. So when I play this back, I get the burst, but it's kind of a mechanical burst. It would be cool if this actually went really fast at the beginning and slowed down towards the end so that I get that burst. In order to do this quickly, we're going to use the Graphene Editor. Now, you probably saw from the Graphene Editor video that this is a lengthy process, but in reality, when we're working with the Graphene Editor, this is how it works. I select all of the keyframes that I have animated, and then I'm going to go and click on that drop-down menu. Before I do that, actually, I turn all of these into Bezier handles. So I select everything and I press F9. That turns everything into easy ease out, or easy ease everything. So then I go to the graph, and you'll notice that when I select, let me go ahead and select everything here in the graph and fit everything on the screen. You'll notice that having everything selected, I can go ahead and start moving things around fairly fast so that I can go ahead and have access to all of these handles to change all of the different values really quick. If you don't want to do it that way, if you want to do one at a time, which you can as well, let me go ahead and go back to linear once again. So I just undid what I had done a second ago. Let me zoom out so that I see everything here. And I am only going to change the values on this one. So I'm going to go Shift F9 to only do easy ease out, easy ease in on that one, easy ease in. That's Shift F9 on the keyboard. And now select everything again. Boom. Now I only have handles for that, and that is the only thing that's the only area where I can actually see curves. So you can do one thing at a time if that is what your intention is. So you have the ability to control each one of these things, each keyframe independent from the others. However, the best option is always to do one of these at a time so that you don't get a very confusing graph. It is always, the reason why I'm showing it to you this way is because it is always helpful to have all of the other keyframes as reference. So let me undo that really quick again. Let me exit the Graphene Editor and bring it back to being linear. And let's go ahead and remove that one. Let's make that 0. Let's bring this one down here, change its value to 0, and change, instead of having that to 0 at the beginning, have it to be 100. And so they disappear as it goes. Now, when I do that and I select only these keyframes and I press F9 to make them Bezier, then I can go ahead and open up the Graphene Editor, and that gives you a much cleaner graph. Remember, this is something I said when we first started moving things on a path, which was the least amount of keyframes that you have, the smoother your animation will be, and the simpler it will be to animate. As you can see, you have a lot of things that have been created here and that have been changed, but that you have access to, easier to see and to compare the value of those handles as you are changing the values in here in the Graphene Editor. And you can keep basically a a visual reference without it being cluttered. Now, if you really want to affect the curvature of these things, you can either do it by, you can actually, the way to do it would be to switch your the way you're viewing your curves in the graphing editor from value graph to speed graph. And remember, that gives you basically a visual representation of the speed of change on the on that curve versus what is happening on the screen versus time. So what you want to do is if you start changing with all of the keyframes selected, you'll notice that you're affecting all the values of the different keyframes. Notice that all the keyframes in the back at the end of my animation, let's go back to the value graph, are selected. Let me fit them all on the screen. You'll notice that they're all selected. And they were all selected by default because when I started, I had just selected them all to turn them into Bezier keyframes. So if I go ahead and turn on the graphing editor and switch my graph to the speed graph, now I can go ahead and fit everything to screen. And since everything is selected, all my curves will be changed accordingly. So this is why I said earlier that this is a little bit faster. My workflow is a little bit faster when I do it this way, because I am making all the changes at the same time, and it should be represented on the actual video. When you play it back, let's take a look. You basically have more control as to what things are happening. If I move this back, now I got more visibility for it. And the scaling value of the box, the size of the box is changing also. And I have basically control of all the keyframes, of the speed of change of all the keyframes by having them all selected over here. So that makes my workflow a little bit easier and makes it a little bit more organic, so to speak. So let me go ahead and zoom out again and play this back. And that gives you more of that burst. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that that burst doesn't have to be in the center of the screen. You can go ahead and, now that you have it as a pre-composition, being it's an actual separate composition, I can go ahead and drop it here if I want to. And when I play that back, my burst will be part of that pre-composition that goes there. So you can sort of create pre-production pieces for something that you have designed in your mind that you want to bring to life, and literally just create separate objects and bring them all into one final composition. And that is the actual workflow when you're working in any of these motion graphics projects.